Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Brandywine online for our virtual program, Behind the Scenes of Andrew Wyeth Human Nature. My name is Bailey Gamberg, and I'm the educator of adult and community programs at the Brandywine Museum of Art. I'm going to start with just a few reminders. We greatly encourage you to come visit in person and see this fantastic exhibition titled Andrew Wyeth Human Nature. The exhibit includes a range of portraiture across Andrew Wyeth's lifetime and will be open until June 15th, 2025. I'd also like to share that next month online, on April 28th and 29th at 7 p.m., we will be hosting two virtual talks with Victoria Wyeth, the granddaughter of Andrew Wyeth. This program will be specifically focusing on the final decade of Andrew's life and career. You can learn more information and register for these programs by checking out the events page on our website. While we are on Zoom today, I would appreciate it if you would stay on mute during the presentation. Feel free to use the chat and Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions throughout the program, and we will get to answering all of them at the end. We will also be recording this talk and sharing the link out in a couple of weeks. We're grateful to have with us today Dr. William L. Coleman, the Wyeth Foundation Curator and Director of the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth Study Center. And I will hand it over to him to share more about this lovely new exhibition.
Thank you, Bailey, and thank you all for joining us today for a midday program about this latest collection exhibition from the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth Study Center. So hopefully you've gotten to see some of our past projects by now. This is part of our ongoing series where we draw on the incredible riches of the Wyeth Foundation collection, now entrusted to the management of the Brandywine, in an ongoing series of focused deep dives into the stories this incredible repository of creative process can tell. So this is our latest thematic. I'll just remind you of some of the past ones. We've gone deep on aspects of landscape and architectural painting. We've talked about Wyeth and abstraction, the problem of being a realist artist when abstraction was the thing to do in the big city. We've talked about Wyeth and the botanical subject and how he related to the natural worlds he inhabited. We've gone deep most recently on the main context of his work. And now it's high time we focus on one of his major genres, figure painting or portraiture, the human body as a subject. So you'll see in the Andrew Wyeth Gallery now at the Brandywine until June, an incredible cross-section of his response to the subject matter of the body across a lifetime, how he learned to draw it, some of his early subjects, self-portraits, family members, mature practice on paper, as well as his beloved medium of tempera on panel. And then some unexpected stories, commissioned portraiture, painting a wealthy patron for pay, as well as the sometimes challenging body of work with nude models. We have to tackle that subject head on. So lots of rich things to get into here. I'll tease things to come as well in this same space, this beautifully renovated Andrew Wyeth Gallery at the Brandywine. This is the last project in that space before our first really big nationally traveling exhibition, which is currently open in North Carolina. Andrew Wyeth at Kerner Farm, The Eye of the Earth, which has a beautiful book published by Rizzoli Electa that's now on sale. When I come to an image of Carl Kerner in this PowerPoint a little later, I hope you'll think of that incredible subject matter, a farm down the road, which had certainly figural subjects to inspire the artist, but also so much more across some 7 decades of practice. So we're really excited for that, and we're going to keep on having great stories to share in this space as we try to do rigorous, thoughtful, scholarly projects that bring nuance and insight to a really beloved body of work, as well as no small number of artworks that have never been exhibited before. So we're pretty excited about this stuff. I hope that you are too. Let me tell you a little bit about what's been happening here in this project. We're interested in how figure painting fits into some of the larger goals, the driving forces of Andrew Wyeth's painting practice, this persistent concern with the unseen, the unspoken, that which lies beneath the surface of things. We see that in his landscape practice, where he's evoking layers of history and incident in the landscape. I think you'll see that also in how he depicts the human form. He is enigmatically evoking inner lives, inner monologues, and all that these people have witnessed with this um, incredible superpower of empathy, as I think about it, to briefly step into a model's life, to try to understand them as completely as any outsider ever could, and then to move on to another subject and to do this across the decades. We see a pattern as we go through this checklist, and I'll share some of my favorite objects in it of forming really deep bonds with particular models, earning people's trust, becoming a part of their lives, and gaining the ability to make really intimate, powerful, and rare figural works. Even as we celebrate what's special about this artist who is such a strength of the Brandywine collection, it's important also to emphasize the ways in which he's connected to broader cultural cross currents. And that's one of our persistent goals. We don't want to just love Andrew Wyeth to death in isolation in Chad's Ford. We want to reinsert him into this really interesting and sometimes messy time and culture that he was a part of. And in this case, we're thinking about who was he learning from? Who was inspiring him to paint the body? How does this work relate to other things happening in the same time and before and after? I'll try to remember to come back to that note of contemporary artists working with the human form who cite Andrew Wyeth as a model. Um, to start, we think about Andrew Wyeth learning to draw to understand the famously complex subject matter of the human body, that classic painterly challenge of depicting a hand or the contours of a torso. And like so many artists had before him, he starts by drawing from the model. And let me see if I can get my darn slide to advance here. I'm gonna have to exit out. Sorry about this, folks. It's not behaving for me. I'm going to get back into my screen share and we will see if it'll actually let me advance. There we go. That's more like it. So here are some of the early drawings you will see as you come into this exhibition, the first things you see on the left. And what really excites me about these is a classic painterly method of learning that is eminently expected for so many other artists in Western art, but not what we usually think about with Andrew Wyeth. We have this kind of received wisdom that Andrew Wyeth arrived in the womb fully formed as an artist, did not receive a conventional artistic training. Even as he doesn't go to a place like the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, Pratt, all these other great art schools of the United States, he is receiving a rigorous academic education from his dad. And that's what you see right here. This object on the left is a kind of a smoking gun. You can't quite make it out in the resolution on your screen here, but we have two sketches of a nude live model standing in the NC Wyeth studio, Andrew Wyeth's classroom, and we see NCW, the father, sketching out the broad contours of that body, and AW, responding to his father's teaching and capturing that pose we call contrapposto, the classical pose of so much Greco-Roman statuary. How special, how fascinating to see side by side, father and son, student and master, learning from a live body there in front of you. And we have another interesting dichotomy here on the right. We can take you from a never before exhibited sheet in the Wyeth Foundation collection to a book in the family library. And this is a book that Andrew Wyeth was given for Christmas in 1936 by N.C. Wyeth, and we can show you that one-to-one association, a reproduction of a Leonardo da Vinci red chalk drawing and young Andrew Wyeth learning from those who had come before. So he's learning from the live model. He's learning from the nude figure. He's learning from historic art that has happened before. He's also learning from plaster casts. And this is an intriguing example also shown in the exhibition, sketching after this plaster cast that you might notice is missing its skin. So a model of human musculature, a flayed figure, which we call an écorché. And this plaster is still in that collection too. Again, the constant refrain. We are so fortunate to be able to tell this story of how ideas take shape. We've got the books he was learning from. We've got the drawings he was making at the very beginning. And here we've even still got that original plaster model that he was learning from in this drawing. So you do see a classic diligent study method as he's slowly building up this toolkit that would then become effortless and organic through all these works that follow. This is where that story begins, and I love how that helps us to understand Andrew Wyeth as part of a continuum of global art practice, not some kind of flash in the pan or anomaly who emerges whole cloth out of nothingness in southeastern Pennsylvania. A much more interesting story of descent and inheritance and indeed departure from what had come before. After those early sketches from the model, he turns to his own face. The self-portraits are a ready subject matter as he's trying to move forward in the depiction of the human form. He sometimes bristled at the constraints of painting a live model, and for his own body, perhaps he had a little more control and could capture the facets that he wanted. He gave us a great quote about that experience of sketching from the live model, that it gives us the title of our exhibition, so I should give it to you here. Describing these painting sessions, these sketching sessions. The local people would come for maybe 3, 4 hours a day and would pose in a position I would fix them in. And I'd work in oil or perhaps charcoal. When I tell them to have a rest for 15 minutes or so, I'd really begin to work. That's when they would sit or stand or relax in odd, truly human positions. That was really the human figure. I was getting something absolutely real, akin to human nature. So we have a sense that even as he's doing the due diligence of academic training, doing what his father told him, he's bristling at the constraints of that, the artifice of that, the fact that we're doing exactly what we've been supposed to do for 500 years. Getting into the self-portrait, he can start to find his own way. We don't have an explanation for why there is no eye here. It's a kind of an eerie image. Maybe it was just never finished. Maybe he liked that enigmatic quality. Nominations welcome, but there's no record in the archive of exactly why that is. I'll note also with this early self-portrait, you are seeing an example of Wyeth working in oil on canvas, which is not a very common medium for this artist, as the super fans of Wyeth know. You'll see at least one more oil here in my remarks, and we kind of welcome that opportunity to show that rarely exhibited body of work. Again, the riches of the Wyeth Foundation collection entrusted to Brandywine. We've got a few dozen of these oils that are his early student work. They're often not the best paintings he ever made, but they are very intriguing evidence of him finding his way. They often look rather more akin to regionalist painters of the period like Thomas Hart Benton or Grant Wood. There is a more conventional pictorial outcome possible in the oil body of work. But quickly he sets aside childish things, hones in on his mature media of watercolor and tempera, and decides oil, that most common of painting media, is not for him for the long term. We see him embracing tempera in this wonderful mature self-portrait, I should say, coming into maturity. I think of this great work, which is kind of the first sightline you get when you enter the Andrew Wyeth Gallery, as the end of his apprenticeship. This is an artist who is reaching the height of his powers, finding the key tools that he's going to use for the rest of his life, and presenting with real confidence. A couple of years after, in 1939 there, what we think of as the Big Bang moment for Andrew Wyeth, the sellout exhibition of watercolors at New York's Macbeth Gallery. After that, he's one of the hottest young artists in America, getting major press coverage, and already starting to eclipse his father in public reputation. So maybe we feel a little bit of that in this image. And the dog is a favorite, shows up in many of his works. Lupe, the one we think of as his first ever painting in that prickly, challenging medium of egg tempera on panel, is a portrait of Lupe. So someday we're going to have to do a deep dive on Wyeth as a painter of animals. That's a really interesting story. I think it'll be the most popular thing we ever do. And I think we can make it also produce productive of insight. It's kind of an under discussed aspect of his practice. So stay tuned for more on that. This is a useful dichotomy. I've talked about oil and moving to tempera. Here we can see just a few years apart, those two media, the same subject, and the gulf between them. Painting his sister Anne, a composer, really interesting creative force in her own right, first in oil and then in tempera. First in this fairly conventional pose, looking almost directly out of the canvas. And then second, this odd view of her, looking down on her from above. It's a little unsettling. We, the viewer, and the artist by extension, are kind of looming over Anne, looking down at her as she catches us in her peripheral vision. So we have a sense of real growth in those 3 years of learning and development between the oil and the tempera here. So his family members serve as ready models in these early days, just as he's paying local people to come in and pose as models and learning the figure any way that he can. His own family ends up being a really useful training method. It's relatively rare to see Andrew Wyeth producing highly finished works in pencil or charcoal, and this is a really rich example of that. His sister, the artist Carolyn Wyeth, another member of this American creative dynasty, who's a fascinating figure in her own right. Mostly, we think of an artist who found his path in watercolor and tempera. So these outlier media, but just a few dozen or so really highly finished pencil works are all the more exciting for that reason. Catching her there, evidently at the site we know as the NC Wyeth studio. I mentioned the Kerners as our next big focus, and here's Carl Kerner, another of these lovely pencils. I think we can all sort of understand that medium, even if tempera feels really distant from our experience. You probably know the drill by now, but let me quickly remind you how tempera works. Crack an egg, separate out the white from the yolk, pierce the yolk sac, drain out the liquid inside the yolk, mix with distilled water, not tap water, and then grind up mineral pigments and mix it all together. You can use it for about 2 days before it's ruined and you have to start a new batch. Really time consuming, really fiddly, build it up in tiny fine layers. This is not that. This is that ordinary pencil that we've all sort of held in our own hands and can understand the sheer virtuosity of evoking the subtle shading of a face in this way, the care and attention that is expended upon capturing every hair, every wrinkle of a friend and model as this place-based practice continues, rooted in just a 5 mile radius around Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, and another 5 miles around Port Clyde, Maine, coming to know the people of this place deeply, and earning access to their lives over years of building trust so that he can capture a hardworking local farmer and hunter in a quiet moment like this in profile. I mentioned commissioned portraits, and this is a really intriguing body of work that might come as a surprise to some of you. We think of Andrew Wyeth as an artist who worked solely on speculation, painted only for personal pleasure, went wherever his inspiration led. But there is a small body of commissioned portraits where he agreed to flatter a wealthy patron by making a lovely image of them. And the most famous instance of this is the portrait he made of Henry Francis DuPont, most famous as the founder of the Winterthur Museum Garden and Library, just about 20 minutes down the road from his studio, and an inspiration for some of the Wyeth's collecting interest and the way they used historic architecture, the focus of a future project. So we include a never before exhibited study for the famous tempera in the Winterthur collection. And I'll have you know, we really tried to get Winterthur to loan that one to us. We wanted to bring that tempera into the gallery here, and they really tried. They were eager to collaborate with us, but we in Wyeth World are hearing about the significant structural challenges that many of his temperas are facing, and this is one where serious condition issues made it difficult to travel that painting even 20 minutes up the road. So that's one of the many things we're working on behind the scenes machines, working with the best conservators to find new techniques to stabilize the temperas and keep them happy and available to audiences for years to come. So at least we can see the study for it. You'll see him tracing lines onto it, a kind of grid, so that he can transfer quadrants of the picture onto that tempera. Once he finds that right composition he likes, grid it out and then work it onto the finished panel. The question we ask ourselves about these commission portraits, and you'll have to ask yourself if you get a chance to come into the gallery and look at these things with us, is did his work suffer from the circumstances of a commission? Is a painting of a rich guy like Henry Francis Dupont worse than a painting made solely from the urgent creative impulse that drives something like that pencil of Carl or of his sister Carolyn? It's a difficult one to answer, but I do think that the commission portraits he made are satisfying works of art in their own right. He does find levels of psychological depth and ways of evoking interiority, even in a job that might have seemed somewhat restrictive to us. So to discuss, and I'll be curious what others think about this. We get then into his mature work in tempera, and we are so fortunate to bring out some of the greatest hits here that happen to be figure paintings. This is one you may not have seen before, and you can imagine why we choose to bring this out. An unfinished figure painting that gives us a sense how you build a tempera. So I've evoked that medium painting with egg and crushed rocks, basically. Here, the local girl, Dana Talley, was not willing to come back and sit for another session. She was too busy running around, had school and all these things. So the thing was left unfinished. And you have a sense of how he slowly builds up these layers of a tempera. It's not just one thin, gauzy surface of paint, but many layers of thin applications of pigment to produce that luminous effect, like they almost glow from within, like they have a kind of an inner light. So I think that's really useful to understand what's behind the curtain, the time scale of his tempera practice, the sheer labor required to make a tempera, in contrast to a watercolor, which is an improvisatory medium, something you can make really quickly. Certainly, there are highly finished temperas we call highly finished watercolors that we call dry brush watercolors that can look almost like a tempera, but still, those are a single layer of pigment for the most part, applied very quickly, a matter of minutes or hours as opposed to days or weeks. Nogishik, we're so fortunate to be able to bring this out of the vault and to put this on view. You've seen a fair number of oblique and profile views, and this one comes as a rather startling view. You're walking through the gallery, and suddenly you're the object on view. You feel Nogishik gazing back at you. Nogishik Akwash was a member of the Ojibwe of Walpole Island First Nation in Ontario. He was an active member of the American Indian Movement, AIM. We know that he was coming through Chatsford in a year of a lot of major actions, including personally occupying the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in Washington, D.C. A fascinating person who spoke truth to power and lived out his principles. And Andrew Wyeth, I think, sensed some of that power and asked to paint him and made this incredible, powerful, somewhat unsettling image where we feel seen in the way so many of Andrew Wyeth's models must have. And we'll come back to that point. What did it feel like to be the subject, to be the object of Andrew Wyeth's gaze? This one we're celebrating as a new acquisition by Brandywine. It has been on view in the past as a long-term loan, and you'll see from the credit line here these little captions that have lots of stories to tell on the walls of museums. That something has changed, and very recently this thing has kindly been gifted to the Brandywine. So we finally have in the collection a really major work depicting Wyeth's most famous model of all, Christina Olson of Christina's World fame, that iconic tempera in the Museum of Modern Art. A very different depiction of her from Christina's World. If you know that work, distant, sweeping, a figure in a vast landscape with an enigmatic building in the distance. Here again, that ability to earn the trust of your subjects, get access to these interiors, and to depict with real sensitivity these intimate, quiet moments. And this one feels to me like nothing so much as the portraiture of the Dutch Golden Age. We're always eager to emphasize those linkages between Andrew Wyeth's work and others. That kind of connective tissue was not a popular topic in Wyeth world until not that long ago. There was a feeling that Andrew Wyeth's work would suffer by comparison, and we don't feel that way anymore. This incredible creative legacy belongs to the world now, and we're all trying to make sense of it and understand the choices that went into its making. I think it only benefits from being placed in a continuum of masterful figure painting practice across the centuries. And you might think of some of those Dutch painters, most of all Rembrandt, whom Andrew Wyeth venerated, famous as a self-portraitist, among other things. And we have in the family library so many books of Rembrandt's work to prove the depth of that interest. Another iconic figure painting that takes on new significance in a show all about the act of depicting the body. This famous image of his wife, Betsy James Wyeth, creative partner, business manager, environmental designer who was shaping many of the three-dimensional landscapes and buildings that Andrew Wyeth depicted. The subject of our 2026 exhibition, By Design, The Worlds of Betsy James Wyeth. Here depicted in Quaker plain dress, evoking the theological history of the Chadsford region, a lot of fascination with the historic peace churches in Wyeth world, and here wearing that distinctive garb of the Quakers and very simple in color palette, just as Andrew Wyeth's own chosen color palette was severely reduced and restricted by the time of his own work. I've been thinking a lot about the concept of simplicity, which is a really resonant term for the Religious Society of Friends or Quakers, and that powerful sense of simplicity as a source of layers of depth and reverence is something that resonates throughout Andrew Wyeth's practice. The topic of, again, another talk for another day. I love this pairing side by side. And as you come through the exhibition, we're getting into the latter part of my remarks here with plenty of time for questions. Please feel free to drop comments or questions into the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'll be glad to hear your thoughts on all this. I love these two verticals side by side, and you can sort of look through the gallery from one wall to another in the distance and see these two vertical figures looking to their left, and think about the choices that went into making each. As you may know, Andrew Wyeth made many depictions of models of color, that Chadsford was a multicultural society in his lifetime in a way it has ceased to be to the same extent in the latter 20th and 21st centuries, and had significant relationships with many members of that African American community, of whom James Loper is one, a friend and regular model. Enigmatically gazing skyward. We might wonder what he sees up there. We might wonder about the story of these cut open shoes with toes allowed to breathe, and that somewhat menacing scythe hovering over his head. Um, and at right, that classic figure in the Brandywine permanent collection of roasting chestnuts by the side of the road, a figure that feels timeless, placeless, could be anywhere, a body against the void almost, divorced from time, incredibly slender, like he's about to be blown away. So love the way that composition resonates across the years in Wyatt's work. We have a very, oops, there's a typo there. That should not be collection of the Wyeth Foundation for American Art. This is a rare instance where we have a private collection loan, indeed, a loan from the subject. Professor Joyce Hill Stoner is a leading art conservator and close associate of the Wyeths. She's one of my bosses on the board of the Wyeth Foundation for American Art as I navigate between organizations in our unique structure. She's one of our major advisors in Wyeth World on the care and feeding of Andrew Wyeth's art. And through that sustained relationship with Andrew Wyeth and Betsy Wyeth as well, got the dignity of being painted. And she gave us some reflections that we put on the wall of the exhibition as we try to understand the other side of this operation. What did it feel like to be seen in this way? The headline for many of these models who left recollections of it is that it was not a comfortable experience. There's a feeling of being the only thing that mattered to this artist for a period, that he's seeing right through you to your darkest secrets, this unrelenting gaze. And then, as soon as the painting's finished, he's done with you at the same time. And that was painful for some of his models. An incredible focus, but then also this incredible creative drive that pulled the artist on to other subjects just as quickly. So let me give you, if you'll forgive me for reading a little bit, I'll share with you the words of Professor Stoner about this experience. He first tried sketches with me in a black hat and then abandoned that and would say, "Let's go to lunch." I, of course, thought, "Oh no, this is the end." But then, on another day, he called me, worked, and finished the most beautiful and detailed pencil sketch, and then said, "Now I will make it a watercolor." I wanted to say, "Oh no, it's beautiful as it is," but he painted the watercolor, not ever allowing me to look directly at it, so I would sneak little peeks when he wasn't looking. Again, he just closed his drawing pad and said, "Let's go to lunch." And I never knew if it was finished or abandoned until he presented to me the finished watercolor framed for Christmas. He always kept his models on tenterhooks. I'm amused to hear, and there's a separate conversation we had that's on YouTube now. Joyce Stoner talking about her life with this body of work and the conservation of these works. A professional art conservator living with an Andrew Wyeth of her own. She does the professional art conservator thing, and she leaves this thing on her wall with a black velvet curtain hanging over it at all times so that it won't be faded by light exposure. And she has been very generous to let us put it on the wall for a few months without a curtain over it. So you'll have to come and see it while it's here. We've got some instances in the show where we can show you the process of breaking a body down into its constituent parts and then rebuilding it for a major tempera. So I believe this is never before exhibited, a lovely study we call Fur Hat that relates to an iconic tempera in the Brandywine collection, Adam. And you see him just honing in on the face of his subject, Adam Johnson, and then building back up to make that great tempera, reinserting him in the surroundings of his farm buildings, distant birds, Kerner Hill, that powerful, massive figure kind of looming over us in the mid ground. We get then to our final case study of Wyeth and the nude subject, and you might say this figure doesn't look very nude to me. The final picture that comes out of this was a nude, and this gives me an excuse to talk about one of the more challenging things we deal with in Wyeth world, which is sometimes the titles that Betsy Wyeth gave to Andrew Wyeth's work are punny and playful, and have sometimes caused folks to underestimate the work. Here, Man in the Moon study is not just a nocturnal subject; it is thinking about other meanings of the term mooning, and the final figure is indeed mooning the viewer. And so there was a little giggle about that. It's an amusing subject, but I think when we look at the work through the lens of that mildly playful title, it sometimes makes it harder to understand this as a really fascinating example of a lifelong creative impulse to delve into the layers of story that the human body could tell. And so that's something that we're thinking about a bit. Some of the titles are trickier than others. And my final case study here, we had to tackle what might be for those who know a kind of elephant in the room. One of Wyeth's major models and major nude subjects was Helga Testorf. And this body of work is undeniably one of his major creative responses, hundreds of works across a number of years. A really important bond formed with one particular model who came to play a very direct role in his practice. As you may know, this body of work had a kind of a publicity firestorm drummed up around it, and that too has been difficult to see with fresh eyes. There has long been a kind of prurient public response to it, a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, about whether something improper happened between artist and model. And I hope that as time passed, we can move beyond that question I don't find very interesting to the deeper one of how is this like a landscape? How is this reflection on the body as a layered subject with what is outward and what is inward, like almost an archaeological excavation, presenting to us these unseen and untold stories through the subject matter of the human body. One picture, the tip of an iceberg, one more piece of evidence of this lifelong practice in response to the human body. And with that, I'll conclude, and I hope that you will come and see this exhibition for yourselves in person. It is up until early June. And then after that, as I mentioned, a wonderful exhibition with a lot of loans from across the country coming to this space. So we'll have to do another program for that show. I'm going to get out of my screen share and we'll see if we have any good questions we can answer. All right. Yes, indeed. Jean Beretta, Joyce Hill Stoner for the Insiders is wearing Anna Kerner's jacket. Joyce promises one of these days to make our social media manager's day by coming into the gallery wearing that jacket and to let us take a picture of her in front of her portrait. So we'll see if we can make that happen. Thorpe asks about tempera condition issues. Yeah. Tempera, when it's done right, when you get the mixture right, it should be rock solid. It is not like work on paper, watercolor, which is always going to be light sensitive, no matter what we do, no matter what new technology of lighting or glass in front of it. It is always not going to love being in direct light. Tempera does not have that same degree of light sensitivity, but there are a number of instances, more than we would like, where temperas have issues with vibration and movement, flaking issues, frankly. We have found ways of mitigating some of the more mild issues of this kind. And you might have, if you follow Brandywine social media accounts, you might have seen a complicated thing we just did for the major tempera Snow Hill, which was putting it in a huge microclimate inside the frame that looks the same as it always did. It has been very carefully and precisely tailored to allow for a sealed box that creates a constant, unchanging humidity and also helps to stabilize temperature changes to make that fragile tempera a lot happier and safer when it travels. Not all of his temper issues can be addressed in that way. And so, what you hear when your job is putting Andrew Wyeth exhibitions together and trying to get the story on the road, a concerning number of Andrew Wyeth temperas are being said to never travel again. So there's huge possibility in the work on paper. We need to embrace the watercolor practice because that's where there's growth and opportunity. The temperas are going to become an ever rarer opportunity that you'll have to come to places like the Brandywine to see in abundant numbers. Let's see. The choice of skin tones and Miss Olson. That's an interesting question. I'm not aware of tempera having dramatic changes in tone over the years. A good question. And some pigments do have that characteristic, fading or changing. Fugitive pigments, they're called, when they don't stay the way the artist intended them. The president of the Royal Academy, Sir Joshua Reynolds, his work famously had a lot of experimental pigments that have dramatically changed over the years. That's not what we see so much in Andrew Wyeth's work. The way he thinks about color is a really rich topic, and I don't have any very specific reflections for you about how that works with skin in particular. But he did have this overarching restriction on the tools at his disposal, this choice to hone in on a severely limited range of colors at his disposal, and perhaps that's impacting the appearance of the skin tone of Miss Olson. Some Velasquez, that's a very interesting suggestion as another area of reference. We can be confident that an artist of that level of global significance was on Andrew Wyeth's radar for one reason or another. Like us in the 21st century, Andrew Wyeth is living in a visual economy. He's reading magazines, he's reading the newspaper, he's watching TV, he's watching movies. He's aware of what other people are making in other places. Sometimes we can pin that down to specific comments he made, specific books in the family library. I'm not aware of any specifically about Velasquez, but I'm sure he would have been aware of that artist. And I see what you mean when you get those strange, dark backgrounds in particular. There's a Southern European evocation, a sense of a Dutch or Spanish interior world that he must have been thinking about. Um, what does Andrew own to Howard Pyle's style and philosophy? That's one of our persistent ones in Wyeth World. We certainly see um, a persistent received value placed on truth to your subject matter that NC embodied from his own teacher Howard Pyle. Um, we are getting somewhat removed by the time Andrew Wyeth comes along from the overt narrative tradition of displaying a story unfurling before your very eyes. And through its progression to NC and then on to Andrew, we get to this realization of a really distinct set of artistic values, leaving things unsaid and unspoken and unarticulated. That is the polar opposite of Howard Pyle's method. But the connective tissue I would suggest to conclude that answer is a notion of authenticity as a core defining value. And what that authenticity means is a little different for Pyle, NC, and Andrew. For Pyle and NC, it might be about using the props, the stuff of the time and place you're depicting. For Andrew, it's a little bit more about living with place, slow looking, immersion in your built or figural subjects and coming to understand them deeply, kind of subsuming them into your painting and then embodying that in a visionary practice. Will any part of the exhibit make it up to the Farnsworth? A good question. As some people are aware, we have this really unique structure for the Wyeth Foundation collection. Wyeth Foundation staff are running collection, care, and research facilities in two places. One of those on the Farnsworth campus, and some of our exhibitions have gone to both places. I'll share that an exhibition some Brandywine folks will remember from very early in my time here, home places about Andrew Wyeth and the old buildings of Chad's Ford, will be going to Farnsworth next. That was unexpected. That was by specific request from my colleagues at the Farnsworth, so we're excited about that. There's every possibility this one might make a good fit with the Farnsworth exhibition calendar at some point, but no plans for that yet. I am not aware of a James Loper relationship to a painter of that surname in the Barnes Foundation collection. I am currently co-teaching with my colleague Victoria Wyeth a four-session class for the Barnes on Fridays, and so I can ask my colleagues at the Barnes about that and report back. But yeah, I'm not aware of that artist. Let's see. Denise appreciates the explanation. Let's see. Yeah, emotion is a core um, operating principle in Andrew Wyeth's work that is sometimes uncomfortable for art historians like me, who like their paintings to be well behaved and static on a wall and squirm when we get into touchy-feely emotion. But my staff, the people who have worked with Andrew Wyeth and Betsy Wyeth for many years, tell me that this is undeniably and unavoidably a central part of his creative practice, that he was thinking about painting from feeling, and we need to find ways of articulating that. There's a term that has become a pejorative, sentiment or sentimentality, that Andrew Wyeth is sometimes freighted with. That is a term of derision for some. And the question is, how can we find another way forward to make space for sentiment without it becoming a negative value in art, something that is purveying easy pleasures without deeper spiritual, philosophical, intellectual uplift. That's kind of an unresolved tension in the art history of the United States. So you're onto some big complicated issues there. Um, yeah, perfect faces and messy hair. There is an interesting tension there. Your words remind me of another precedent in the history of figure painting, the artist Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, who famously is making these lovely, sensitive images of models who are often from the streets of Rome, and you get a sense of his saints and religious figures with dirt under their fingernails, people who really live messy, complicated lives, and maybe we get a sense of that in a work like Miss Olson in particular. Yes, Adam Johnson, we know a fair bit about him. I don't know about his work with the railroad. I'm sure that's been documented elsewhere. The tidbit that is fresh on my mind is a fascinating letter I saw recently, in which he was the primary advocate for the preservation of his parish church, known as Mother Archie's, which is now, as you may know, a ruin on Ring Road, not far from the Kerner Farm. There are two little parking spots along a busy road where you can go and stop and have a look around. That was early in his life a vibrant African Methodist Episcopal Church community that, through a tangle of taxes and regulations, fell into disrepair. And Adam Johnson was the one who took up pen and tried to convince the township to give it back to his people. Did not succeed in that, but a really interesting sense of somebody who was a kind of a public citizen in his time. Conrad agrees on Northern and Southern art. Ken Burns and a Wyeth series. There have been a fair number of Wyeth documentaries, so I don't think Ken Burns would agree that there's enough meat left for him to chew over, but we all respect the great documentarian. There have been major documentaries about Andrew and Jamie, and I can tease that one is coming about NC from a major documentarian. So I think that that turf has been pretty well covered, and we'll look forward to seeing what's ahead. Does the Great Depression factor into an understanding of Andrew Wyeth's work? He was pretty young when that happened, and he was pretty well insulated by his father's tremendous commercial success. But there is, despite his rigorous focus on southeastern Pennsylvania and mid-coast Maine, a feeling that might be something like the Dust Bowl in some of his works. I could imagine that in Roasted Chestnuts comes to mind, this kind of gray, brown, windswept feeling. He's certainly aware of the regionalist artists who are more overtly engaged with the Great Depression and its attendant socio-environmental calamities, and so it's in the ether there. But he did have a privileged upbringing, and I don't think he was hurt by the depression the way some artists were, and carried that childhood trauma with him, if that's what you're driving at. Yes, there is one great Siri Erickson image there. I had to just select a selection of highlights in this quick overview of what you come to see in the exhibition. This is no more than about a third of the works on view, so you'll just have to come and see more. We have a lovely youthful image of Siri Erickson, a young Finnish girl from Cushing, Maine, in the Brandywine Permanent Collection. Always a fun one because you get a sense of it as, to use the fancy term, a Gesamtkunstwerk, a complete work of art wherein the frame is central to the meaning of the painting, because you see that Andrew and Betsy Wyeth designed the frame to match the woodwork that's visible in the painting. It's good fun. We're fascinated by that as an evidence of a kind of a succession in Wyeth's figural subjects from Christina Olson directly onto Siri very soon after the death of Christina Olson, which was a deep blow to Andrew Wyeth. So yes, if you come through, you'll be sure to see that. I'm talking fast, talking a lot. I hope I answered all the questions there. Really appreciate all those good reflections, and I hope that you will come through and see the show for yourself. I mentioned that we're thinking of this as one of our collection exhibitions, and what that means for us is that we don't do a book for every one of these anymore. We started out with a quick run of books for our first three exhibitions: Edward Hopper and Andrew Wyeth, Rockland, Maine; Abstract Flash, Unseen Andrew Wyeth; and Every Leaf and Twig, Andrew Wyeth's Botanical Imagination. We're now moving into kind of phase two of a multi-year strategy of building up this robust enterprise of Wyeth studies in this new era created by Betsy Wyeth's estate. And we're just going to do about one serious book a year with a national publisher. And so the first of those has just come out. We're very excited about it for this big Kerner exhibition. And right after we get off this call, I'm hopping on with a designer to talk about the next one. So stay tuned for that in 2026. One more question just came in, Denise. Sure thing, Denise. Thank you all for joining us. Anything else from you, Bailey Gamberg?
I just wanted to add that I know the artist in the Barnes collection's name is Edward Loper Sr., and I know that they are both African American and from the Delaware area. So I don't have positive, like, Evidence currently that there's a connection between James Loper and Edward Loper Sr., but I think that there is definitely a likelihood of that, and I'd be curious
Interesting.
to
Yeah.
learn more about that when you teach at the Barnes.
I'm sure somebody on the Brandywine staff already knows this story like the back of their hand. It is new to me. We will look into it. Very intriguing suggestion. Yeah, there's a distinct chance of some sort of family relationship there. Oh,
Um,
yes.
one more
Thanks, Gene,
question
on
about
the
watercolors.
just jumping on the Gene note. Maybe I'm pleased to see Bailey, you have the book over your shoulder there. Maybe you could hold it up because we're so proud of it. Yeah, there we go. Thanks, Gene. Yeah, it's fun to see not only in the Brandywine store and the Reynolda House Museum of American Art store. And if you do want to pick up a copy, we ask you to go to our store. It is fun and it feels kind of official to see it in Amazon and to refresh where we are in the rankings of single artist monographs and things like that. Carol has another question. Let's see. What weight of paper? I don't know the precise weight of paper, but we do know he was using Fabriano cold press paper. There's so many questions about Wyeth's materials, and I keep on pushing my staff to get a kind of an FAQ together that we can put on the web to answer that question. We have started to look at some of his watercolors under a new microscope we bought for our main office that helps us to do paper conservation up there. And it has been fascinating to see how complicated the making of his watercolors is. I've described that as a more spontaneous or improvisatory method, but it is also the case, as you say, that there are layered washes. I'm just trying to emphasize it's not quite as layered and time consuming as the tempers.
Okay,
Okey-doke.
awesome. Those are all the questions that I see in the Q&A and the chat. So thank you so much, everyone who took the time this afternoon to join us. And we'll be sending out the recording link in a couple weeks if you want to look at that again.
Thank you all.
All right. Thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day.